It's a great honor and privilege to be the keynote speaker at the Himal Media Mela and to be able to address journalists from across Nepal who, as Roman rightly pointed out, are today at the forefront of exercising their right as journalists to inform their readers and their viewers. And to do so, they are lucky in an atmosphere that is the freest in South Asia. And of course, I think for somebody from India, it's a moment of great happiness that Nepal, which in many ways has been a pioneer in South Asia in terms of protecting its independence over the centuries, in terms of writing a constitution, however much there may be arguments over its final contents, on the basis of a popular struggle that led to the election of those who would write the constitution. And though it's been a rocky road since then, as is inevitable, the fact that media freedom is seen as something important, sacrosanct, and worth preserving, along with, I dare say, Nepal's historical position over the last several years of being a meeting place for South Asia, for South Asians, a place that provides a platform and a means at a time when other countries are all too happy to close their borders to the cross movement of journalists, academics, scholars, as well as their ideas. I think it's marvelous that Nepal today occupies this position, and I feel very grateful as somebody from India that we have the space, all of us in South Asia have the space where we may come, meet with friends from across the region, and discuss issues of common interest and common concern. This is not to say that a situation which prevails today will always prevail. If anything, the experience that we have in India of freedom of the press, of a constitutionally guaranteed freedom of the press, tells us that unless you remain vigilant and fight and remain alert to protecting what you have, those freedoms and those rights can easily be hollowed out. And we must always remember and never forget that the rights that we enjoy as journalists is a right that we hold and exercise in trust. This is not a right or an end in itself. Freedom of the press has meaning and has value precisely because we are meant to serve as the eyes and ears and the voice of ordinary citizens, of democracy. And historically, whenever democracies have come under strain, whenever they have perished, they have always done so because of the collapse of open, free, democratic media, and or the lack of such media. And the strongest guarantee that we can preserve and extend, because this is not just a question of holding on to what we have. Life is a constant struggle for extending, deepening, and making more meaningful rights that human beings give themselves by dint of being human. And the role of the media in protecting and extending and deepening those rights is something that we must exercise with a great deal of responsibility, but also with courage. And what better a day to reaffirm that goal and aim of ours than May 3rd, which is celebrated worldwide as World Press Freedom Day. The purpose of my remarks today, or the focus rather, is I liked very much the theme of the Mela, which is of Vishwas Ra Atmasamiksha. Introspection, trust, these are essential ingredients to the functioning of free and democratic media. And in a way, it serves to remind us that we aren't an end in itself. We are not the story. And we should never be the story. And that we do what we do in order to serve a higher cause. Whether you want to call that the fourth estate or whatever it is. But the fact is that it's the public at large that depends on the work that we do. And you don't need a keynote speaker to remind you that 2023 and this the era that we are in presently is a moment of great opportunity for journalists. And I'm using the term journalists and journalism in the broadest possible sense of the term. There is a draft law in the United States aimed at protecting journalists from surveillance, spying, and other forms of government control. Sadly, it hasn't yet entered into law, although the US House of Representatives passed it, and it's called the precise title, the abbreviation is the Press Act. And essentially it was triggered by two concerns. The problem of surveillance that reporters are increasingly being subjected to, and I will discuss that in a while. And of course, the pressure that governments and authorities in different countries, but also in the US, are known to exert on outing whistleblowers. In other words, somehow the journalist's duty to protect her source is seen as a threat or a violation to state security. And in the United States, motivated by the desire to protect press freedom, there is a draft law. It's called Protect Reporters from Exploitative State Spying Act, Press Act. And the reason I'm bringing it up at this point is because it has a definition of who is a journalist that I find quite useful. Because often, like every trade, every occupation, we tend to define ourselves by very narrow tools of our craft. I was astonished when I went to give a talk in Tamil Nadu, in Chennai, a few months ago, and I was invited when some journalists heard that I was in town. They invited me to speak to them as well, and they were the Association of Camera Persons of Digital Media Channels. And I said, why is there such a narrow trade body? And they said that's because the conventional, the actual Tamil Nadu Journalists Union is reluctant. They don't consider us to be part of the fraternity. And I don't know if in Nepal you have this problem, but I think that we need to be able to define, because the threats and challenges we face are common. And the Press Act, the draft Press Act in the US defines a journalist, quote, as a person who regularly gathers, prepares, collects, photographs, records, writes, edits, reports, investigates or publishes news or information that concerns local, national, or international events or other matters of public interest for dissemination to the public. And I think that this is a broad enough definition that covers the full range of activities that we do, regardless of whether we work for a quote-unquote legacy media organization, in other words, print or broadcast television, or whether we work for a digital platform like I do and many of you do, or whether we are employed full-time or we are freelance, or whether we simply work pro bono. If you do the work of a journalist, then the protection that journalists enjoy ought to apply to you. And I think that when we speak of the opportunities that we have today and also the challenges that we confront, I think it's important to bear this in mind, that we need to have the broadest possible definition of journalism and journalists, simply because that's the era we live in. When I left the Hindu in 2013, and along with my colleagues M.K. Venu and Siddharth Varadarajan began discussing what we could do, we were aware of the emerging somewhat hostile terrain towards independent journalism. And we also knew that there was a link between the pursuit of journalism and the success with which you can do that, the independence with which you can do that, and the business model which underwrites your work. And the link that we saw was that very often when freedom of the press comes under pressure, it's the owner, investor, the advertiser who tends to be the weakest link, tends to be the point of least resistance. And so for us, we thought we should structure the Wire as a non-profit, but more than that it would be digital. Because for us, we simply lack the financial resources to launch a newspaper or a magazine or any kind of print product, or of course, a broadcast platform. And today, many people who enter journalism, and I would say it's a very good thing that despite the, to my mind, declining quality of the media, and despite the enormous strains that independent journalism and independent reporters face in India, there are still, I would say, thousands of young women and men who are studying to become journalists and are entering the profession every year. This is true of India. I know this is true of Pakistan. It's perhaps true of Nepal too. People still are motivated by the idea of wanting to document, chronicle, report, investigate what's happening in society and present that to a wider audience in the public interest. And so digital and and emerging technologies have given us a huge, have made it possible for us to reach large audiences with relatively limited, despite us having relatively limited financial resources. We don't have to depend on expensive printing presses, on uplinking and downlinking. We don't have to depend on set-top boxes. We don't have to depend on newspaper vendors or hawkers or having a subscription department. And the fact is that the same technological revolution, which gave rise to digital journalism as a specific platform, has also erased the difference between different forms of media. So every newspaper today has its own website. And I dare say, even if that website isn't necessarily highly profitable, or even marginally so for them, it definitely brings them more readers than they have through print. Take the Indian Express, for example, in India. It's one of the legacy newspaper mastheads. Its print circulation is perhaps really quite limited, but it has one of the biggest websites. And every TV channel has a website. Newspapers have begun to record and put out videos on YouTube. There are many stories that TV channels would put up as a written or a text story on their website, even before they run something on the broadcast channel. And of course, web platforms like ourselves do a lot of written stories are our bread and butter, but I would say the salience of video is increasing by the day. And this is what technology has done, and multiple platforms that allow us to disseminate this at the click of a button is the great opportunity that technology in the 21st century has handed us as journalists and reporters, as editors, as publishers. But this is also, and this is unfortunate, this is also an era of unprecedented threats and challenges. And it's ironic that this should be so at a time when, you would imagine the level of democratization in our societies has increased, and there's greater consciousness and awareness of human rights in general. It's ironic that at a time like this, when there is not just growing awareness of the importance of rights, but the extent to which rights of all kinds are now codified in international law, are actually a part of customary international law, whether or not they have specific recognition in a country's constitution or its day-to-day laws, at a time when governments are legally and in many ways at a diplomatic level committing themselves to respecting these freedoms. It's unfortunate that in country after country that otherwise prides itself in being a democracy, the media is coming under strain. And coming under, I would say, the greatest amount of strain in recent memory. And that's a strong statement, because there are many in India, for example, who remember the emergency when there was actual hard pre-censorship and there were arrests that took place. Yet I'm saying this with a great deal of responsibility when I say that the kind of pressure, not just in India but around the world, that journalists and media houses are facing today is unprecedented in recent memory. The scale of it, the depth of it, and also I would say the innovative nature of restrictions, and I will come to that in a second, because just as technology allows us as journalists to reach a wide audience and to do so quite cheaply, and we had assumed at one point that this would make us in many ways immune to censorship, immune to state control, the censorers and the controllers and the authoritarians are also able to make use of the same technology and its opportunities, of course, to block and censor, but equally to muddy the information waters and actually create, perhaps that's what Maria Ressa was talking about, this toxic pipeline of sludge, which creates, which makes the kind of terrain that we as journalists who are working in the public interest that much more difficult to navigate. And I want to keep some time for the amount of stuff that's been allotted for me for Q&A, but I will just run through what I believe are four important categories of these sort of opportunities and threats that we need to take note of as journalists. And I will start with the obvious one, the first one, which is financial. The big problem that all of us must confront, whether you are a small non-profit enterprise or a large media house, Kantipur, for example, one of the major newspaper groups in Nepal, or you have websites, that we in India, are aware of and follow its work. Universally, the challenge that you must deal with is how do you pay for your journalism? And historically, this is no rocket science. You either have to tap into the resources of your readers and viewers, or you have to offer up your readers and viewers to, as consumers, quote unquote, to others who are willing to pay for that or to reach that audience, right? Which is what advertising is all about. And I won't bore you with the historical details. Those of you who have been through J School will have seen those figures of the ideal split between reader revenue and advertising revenue. And at one point it was believed that 50-50 was good, or 60-40 in favor of readers. Today we are in a situation, at least for print newspapers in India, where more than 100% of revenue, in other words, comes from advertising in terms of the share. Now you may ask, how is that possible? Well, the reason is that for some of our newspapers, which sell at a cover price well below the cost of manufacture, each additional sale loses the company money. So there is negative marginal revenue from every extra paper sold. And that money is recouped from advertising or other kinds of activities, which sadly tend to compromise the freedom of the press. Let me give you an example. Because how a media house addresses the financial challenge is really very, very central to its ability to function as an independent entity and to not succumb to corporate or government pressure. And sadly, the path that many media houses in India, I know, have chosen for themselves is the path of least resistance. So when newspapers found that the actual sale of a newspaper, even with advertising, wasn't bringing in the level of profits that they were used to, they turned to organizing events of one kind or the other. And it's become very fashionable. Hindustan Times, for example, has a leadership summit. Or the Times of India will have some other, and India Today. These groups have perhaps dozens of events a year, organized across all their platforms. And in order to ensure that these events are commercial successes, you have to make sure that you can marry, because the commercial success of this rests on your ability to sell this event to interested parties as a great platform for visibility, but also to do business. And I don't mean business necessarily as in you're providing a stock market kind of, matching a buyer and seller. You're basically offering to sponsors the ability to rub shoulders with ministers, with the decision makers and policy makers. So an inordinate amount of time of editors and others who work for these organizations is devoted to sweet talking and chasing ministers over a long haul to ensure that they grace the occasion. And when they come, and you can see these videos available on YouTube, recently there were these embarrassingly, cringe-making videos of the owners of the Times of India group and India Today group, singing the praises of the Prime Minister of India and the Home Minister of India while they were on stage, in the kind of language that you would never expect from a publisher in a democratic country. And so that's the price you pay. And to assume that this is not going to be reflected in the quality of your coverage is to live in a fool's paradise. Of course it's reflected in that. And what Kunda spoke about, the phrase that we use in India, Godi media. Ravish Kumar, who gave the keynote last year, is the person who coined this lovely phrase. But the Godi media syndrome of doing journalism from the lap, sitting in the lap of the powers that be, is an important, is a byproduct of this financial model which has gone completely awry, where you are not in the business of offering news, views, analysis, information to your readers and viewers, but creating a platform where the government can do its messaging. And of course, this failure to, or rather, this syndrome also points us in the direction of what the answer might be, what the correct financial model ought to be in order for us to safeguard our independence. And in a nutshell, the less you have to do with government in terms of revenue, in other words, the less you rely on government advertising or government largesse of any kind or government favors of any kind, the better off you will be. The less you rely on large individual advertisers or company sponsors, the better off you will be. And the more you rely on subscriptions, donations, contributions from your readers, from your viewers, or from other, I would say, citizens and civil society who share a common interest in preserving independent media, the better off and more vibrant and more independent media will be. Now, we know this is the answer, but how easy is it to accomplish? I've been speaking to colleagues from Nepal over the last couple of days, and the paywall is considered in North America and parts of Europe to be the answer to the viability of a website, that you don't make it free and you force the reader to pay a little bit to read. The problem in our part of the world is that historically, people have been used to paying next to nothing even for print. I don't know in Nepal what the prices are, but in India, you could buy a newspaper and at the end of the month sell the newsprint for raddi and end up having spent virtually nothing at all. So if there's no paywall if people aren't used to having sort of navigated a paywall for print, it's unlikely that they will navigate a paywall for digital. However, We do have some examples. Some newspapers in India, Business Standard, The Hindu, which are experimenting. And we have some websites, the Ken, Morning Context, which have a very hard paywall. And they are, I think, slowly but surely making something of a success of it. So I would say that part of our introspection our deep look at the way that we function has to be to ask hard questions of ourselves. That are we producing content which people would want to put a value on and would want to pay to read? It shouldn't come as a surprise that websites or newspapers that have a distinct personality, a distinct voice, that are seen as not run-of-the-mill. And I dare say the Hindu, even though I have my loyalty since I worked there and I shouldn't be saying this, but the Hindu is certainly a newspaper that meets that category, that criterion. The Business Standard perhaps too. The more you have reader loyalty based on the quality of content and the uniqueness of the content that you produce, the greater is the likelihood that you will make a success of getting readers to pay for it. But frankly, in the absence of readers being the major source of revenue, there will always be a financial strain. And then the options are to turn to civil society, which is not impossible. Nepal has that as an ability to turn to philanthropy. No strings attached philanthropy also exists. And it's possible, but that depends on the legal norms, other jurisdictional norms. In India, for example, the government has made it rather quite difficult for large Indian philanthropy, mainly because it's taken a very punitive attitude. So philanthropists who have in the past given large sums of money to independent media platforms found themselves coming under pressure from the government, from ministers, who were asking them, why are you doing this? Because they saw the financing of independent media as a hostile act. And of course, philanthropists get to be philanthropic because they have other businesses. And those businesses in our part of the world, or I dare say in any part of the world, are vulnerable to government pressure when you have politicians, governments that function with a cavalier attitude towards rule of law. Donald Trump, for all his faults, to the best of my knowledge, never sent the income tax department knocking at the doors of the owners of CNN or New York Times. Even if he wanted to, and I'm sure he did, the institutional structures in the US would have been a major obstacle. Sadly, in our part of the world, those kinds of obstacles don't exist. So the Independent Public Spirited Media Foundation, which is a large grouping of philanthropically minded business persons in India, which has given seed money, not just to The Wire, but to a number of other media platforms, found itself being subjected to a tax scrutiny and tax raid and all kinds of investigations, which is a bit odd because it's a non-profit itself. So, but I think philanthropy, if reader revenue is not possible, either through subscriptions or donations, and knocking on the doors of civil society. But I want to flag this, financial independence really holds the key. Because if the reader and the viewer does not pay for content, then somebody else is. And that somebody is going to insist at some point in calling the tune. Of course, depending on the nature of how modern, banking and payment systems are in a given society, this becomes easier or harder. And in India, we are fortunate that micro payments are quite easy. People are able to use their phone to make payments. So the easier you have those kinds of ancillary support, the more viable it is for financial independence to be accomplished or achieved by media platforms such as ours and others. The second set of challenges that we need to flag, and this is, again, central to the idea of trust and introspection, because we have to be able to look inwards. Media freedom is not just about having the right constitution and the right laws and a properly functioning, state institution that doesn't interfere with the work that we do. It's also about how we see ourselves doing the work that we do. And I just want to, not in any particular order, flag two or three things which I believe are important. The first is to have a diverse newsroom. We all live in multi-ethnic, highly plural, highly stratified societies. And newsrooms, if they are to really function as a place that produces stories that touch the lives of everybody, those newsrooms have to reflect, not necessarily in a mechanical way, but they have to reflect the diversity that is out there. Whether we speak of region, whether we speak of language, whether we speak of ethnicity, caste, all of our societies are riddled with stratification. And a few years ago, when a survey was done, informal survey, was done of caste in Indian newsrooms, it was found without, and this didn't surprise anybody, that virtually all editors, all editors and supervisory journalists above a certain level were the so-called Savarn, the upper caste, and the representation of Dalits, Adivasis, or Bahujans in general, even religious minorities, was actually appallingly low. Women in India did somewhat better than in other professions, but even there at the higher level, it may astonish you to know that in all the years of publishing newspapers in India, I think other than Mrinal Pandey and Malini Parsarthi and Jayanti of Deccan Chronicle, I think three. I mean, the number of women who have, made it to being editors. So at the top level, it's still very male-dominated, upper caste dominated, and you have to have a diverse newsroom if you're going to be able to bring those stories. And this is a truth that the American media recognized in the 70s, when the American Society for Newspaper Editors looked at major newsrooms and says, where are the African Americans? And if you don't have African Americans, how on earth do you expect to be able to cover what's happening in the US? And since then, conscious efforts have been made, and today you have a much better situation. The same is true in the UK. Of course, there's much more that always needs to be done, and perhaps glass ceilings of one kind or the other still exist and operate. But compared to the progress that has been made in the US or the UK, I know in India we lag terribly, terribly far behind. And this is something which, in the spirit of Atma Samiksha, media platforms, editors, publishers need to be able to confront. I think that the responsible use of technology and information is another thing that I need to flag. We live in a situation today of great speed. Speed is privileged because people have multiple sources of news, and you have, and the temptation to be fast. A video surfaces, which seems to be showing something that's very, very newsworthy. But the provenance of the video is a little bit questionable. What do you do with that? And even as you are mulling over what to do, you find that a smaller TV channel has gone and put out the clip. And so the pressure to rush out with that, even though you haven't done the full set of sort of verification exercises that you would otherwise do, it's very hard to resist. But media platforms that do resist that and find ways to, of course, verify things or cross-check things speedily, and who privilege that over speed, are the ones that will benefit and prosper and have the reader's trust in the long run. And I say this because I didn't mention when I spoke of technology, the challenges and opportunities, but the great presence of AI in our lives is something that we can't sidestep. All of you, I'm sure many of you have experimented with ChatGPT for a variety of tasks. And there is a great positive side to ChatGPT because a lot of repetitive, mundane, mechanical writing can be handled by the chatbot. But the danger of AI is being recognized now by, among others, its own founders. I forget the name of the gentleman, but there was exactly. Jeffrey Hinton yesterday, there was a piece in the New York Times about how he has left his job at Google in order to be able to freely speak and warn people about the dangers of AI. And these are questions that when I first began to tinker around with ChatGPT sometime last year, I said, how is this possibly of any relevance to me? And today I see all kinds of applications and uses, some positive, some not so positive. And we've had many arguments now, not many, few arguments in our newsroom about AI-generated images. Sometimes we're stuck and you don't have an appropriate photograph to illustrate a particular story. And of course, in the digital medium, you need some visual relief for every story you put out. If it's to show properly on social, whether Twitter or Instagram, you have to have some kind of visual. And if you don't have an appropriate photograph, is AI an acceptable method to source that kind of photograph? And of course, I had colleagues who, I was leaning towards the side of thinking that it perhaps might be, but my colleagues resisted very fiercely, so I had to drop that idea, because there are all kinds of ethical, not so much copyright, but all kinds of wider ethical issues that this sort of thing triggers. So this is again an issue that every newsroom internally has to debate, and please don't assume that this is a debate that you can postpone for even 6 months. AI is already amidst us, and this is an issue that we internally need to fairly confront. The other thing that I wanted to flag is the need to be transparent with errors. The best, most conscientious newsroom can and will make mistakes. We made an egregious mistake last year with our meta stories. When you realize you've made a mistake, it's important to be transparent and to take your readers or viewers into confidence. All too often I see on the internet stories which are simply deleted and vanish. So in the rush to judgment, platforms run a story. I'll give you an example. A few days ago, ANI, which is one of the Indian news agencies, put out a story as to how Pakistani, and this shouldn't surprise you that these kind of stories make it to print, that Pakistanis are so sex crazed that parents have taken to putting a lock on the graves of their dead daughters. It's a shocking story, right? And when I saw the headline, I said, this doesn't make sense at all. But at least 20 respectable outlets ran that story. And now, okay, fine. So ANI put it out. Many people subscribe to ANI, so there's no reason to assume that ANI got it wrong. But after ANI was forced to issue a correction when multiple people pointed out what the truth of even the photograph that they were running really was, most websites changed their story to say that changed it in one way or the other. Others simply just deleted the whole story. So if you click, so you can go to Google, you'll see the headline in a respectable newspaper site that Pakistanis do X, Y, Z. You click on the link and you get a 404 error. No explanation. And I think that this is, I think we need to be transparent with and also have that discipline so that, and the more you follow that protocol, that if you're making a substantive change in a published story, you should take note of what those changes are and why. Sometimes it could be just very minor, grammatical fix, fine. But if there's a major fact that upon verification turned out to be wrong, that needs to be pointed out. Or, so I think that it's important that that measure of transparency be there, because that's one way of building a bond with readers and viewers. At the Hindu, earlier when I was at the Hindu, and now at the Wire, we have what's called a public editor or an ombudsperson, somebody who is outside the editorial chain of command, and who is responsible to receive reader complaints and investigate and adjudicate on them. And we are bound to publish her findings even if we disagree with them or even if they indict us, quote unquote. And this is a practice that newspapers in Japan, some of them in the UK and the US are following as an added measure of transparency. And I would again urge colleagues in Nepal to look at this as a possibility, that you find somebody who has a respectable profile and understands the nature of news gathering, and set her up or him up as a public editor, who then serves as a kind of added window for readers and viewers to be able to reach out if they have an issue, a genuine issue. A lot of complaints could be frivolous or motivated, but it's better if that judgment is taken by the public editor who is not part of your editorial chain of command. and who therefore has a slightly detached, independent perspective from which she can pronounce on this. So I think I would flag that as an important aspect of the challenges that we confront. Now turning to just sort of running out of time, but sort of the external. I've spoken of the tech. I've spoken of the financial. I've spoken of the internal. Of course, the elephant in the room are the external challenges. When we speak of this being a time when freedom of press is under threat, it is largely under threat, not so much because of what we are doing wrong, although there are, I would say, regrettably, many media platforms in India that consciously are undermining the standards of journalism by promoting hate speech, by promoting hate agendas, Islamophobic agendas, and so on and so forth. But it's the external threat, the external challenge that today is something that we need to confront. Kunda and Roman have flagged this already, but in India we are dealing with multiple challenges on multiple fronts. I mentioned how during the emergency there was pre-censorship and the arrest of in many cases, of course, politicians, but also a few journalists. Today in India, it is not uncommon for journalists to be arrested. Of course, those arrests are effected not through a highly visible, transparent declaration of emergency that's out there, and then you can confront that, and the government then has to face the heat for having imposed this blanket restriction. You don't have that. But what you have is a situation where reporters who do stories that the police or chief ministers in different states, if they don't like it, they are quite within their, they are quite willing and able to file a criminal case. So a reporter goes to Banaras, Scroll, in this case, website, goes to Banaras, which is the Prime Minister's constituency, does a story on how Dalit workers are not getting all the benefits that were promised from some government scheme or the other. And next thing we know, she gets a criminal case against her. A colleague of mine interviewed the grandfather of a farmer who had died during a protest in Delhi. And the grandfather said, I don't believe my son's death was an accident. I believe he was shot and killed. My reporter gets a criminal case filed against her for inflaming religious hatred. In the same case of the young farmer's death in Delhi, Mrinal Pandey, who I mentioned earlier, one of the very senior editors in India, Rajdeep Sardesai, Vinod Jose of Caravan, has sedition cases filed against them for reporting that this farmer had been shot dead and not died of an accident. In Jammu and Kashmir, we have many cases there are 2 or 3 journalists that are currently in jail, Fahad Shah, Sajjad Gul, for example, under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and the Public Safety Act. In the case of Fahad Gul, it's so hilarious. The charge against him, he edits a magazine called, Fahad Shah, he edits a magazine called Kashmir Wala. And they ran an op-ed article something like 15 years ago by a lawyer, which, as have many articles in many publications in India, spoken about what many people in Kashmir say is their right to self-determination. And this 15-year-old article becomes the basis for an anti-terrorism case against the editor. The editor gets locked up. And as happens in many publications, you have an acting editor. So in this case, because it's a small organization, the acting editor was somebody who, when he became acting editor, was, I think, aged 28 or 29. And he got a summons as acting editor from the police to explain why Kashmir Wala had published this article back 15 years ago. And he had to tell them, look, I was only 13. So I don't know. But this is the level to which the law can be abused in order to harass, intimidate reporters. And there are, during COVID, for example, reporters in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, in Tamil Nadu, in Himachal, in UP, who did stories in the public interest, pointing out failures in the public provision of goods for families who were trying to cope with the lockdown and so on. These guys had cases against them. At one point, News Laundry did a count, and there was more than 60 or 70 such cases of reporters who had criminal cases filed against them and who had then had to spend weeks, months, and in some cases a couple of years to be able to finally get those cases dropped. So the filing of criminal charges is a new threat that we now deal with. In the past, it used to be defamation only. But now you have these criminal charges where you could be charged with spreading a rumor with a view to inviting insurrection against the state, or other kinds of serious charges where the idea is to have a chilling effect and to make sure that a reporter looks over her shoulder and an editor looks over her or his shoulder every time they get a story that's a little bit, the government isn't going to like. And I think that this tendency in India is a major new assault on freedom of the press, and is a big reason why today we speak of the press in India being under great strain. Surveillance is another a big problem that I want to identify. When we were part of the Pegasus project, along with Forbidden Stories and a bunch of newspapers abroad, and we investigated the India leg, we found something like 45 to 50 journalists on the list of probable Pegasus targets, and we found evidence of Pegasus through forensics that the Amnesty International Tech Lab did. We found the presence of Pegasus in at least 5 or 6 journalist phones, including myself, my colleague M.K. Venu, Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, and this represents a dramatic escalation in surveillance. Now every journalist worth his or her salt assumes that their phones are being tapped, and it's good protocol. I think here too people use, perhaps you use Signal or WhatsApp for many calls and many kinds of messages on the assumption that this is encrypted and cannot be accessed. However, if your phone is infected with spyware like Pegasus, then the entire mirror image of what you see on your phone is available to the intelligence agencies. And this is regrettably something that we still don't have closure on. In the US, even though no US journalist was, I think, directly targeted with Pegasus, but Congress is trying to pass a law making it illegal to use spyware against the phones of journalists. But in India, you have a government that refuses to answer questions, even when the Supreme Court squarely puts it to them, that have you or have you not bought and used Pegasus? And the government says, we're sorry, we can't answer this question. And the court is simply giving the government a free pass. So I think that surveillance is a very real, clear, and present danger that we need to confront. There is also a move to amend the legal infrastructure that governs the functioning of the press. I will mention here the information technology rules, which is perhaps the most obnoxious initiative that the current government has taken, where they have given themselves the power to declare as fake or misleading news items. So if there is a news item published somewhere, the government will say this is fake or misleading. And once the government makes that declaration, against which there is no appeal and there's no discussion or argument, intermediaries lose their safe harbor protection from hosting or carrying that bit of news. So let's say I do a piece saying that there is no press freedom in India, or press freedom in India is under strain, and government says this is fake and misleading. Then, if Twitter is carrying a link to my speech, then Twitter will come under enormous pressure to delete that link. Why? Because some guy somewhere will file a case. As I said already, the police in India is becoming increasingly trigger happy when it comes to media reports critical of the government. So somebody will file a case, could be a BJP activist, saying that this speech by Siddharth being carried on Twitter and make all kinds of wild charges that this has affected my religious sentiment as a Hindu, or that this speech is fomenting enmity. So if he files that kind of an FIR in a police station, and then Twitter then finds itself at the receiving end of a criminal case. So Twitter, especially under Mr. Elon Musk, is more likely to simply say, just get rid of the content. So we saw this happen, by the way. This isn't just a theoretical example. When the government took great offense to the BBC's documentary on the Gujarat riots of 2002, which they were narrating, by the way, as part of the backstory to understanding Mr. Modi's prime ministership. Right? So if you're trying to do a story on a documentary on Mr. Modi's current rule as Prime Minister, and you're looking at the allegation that Muslims are being targeted in some way or the other, then you have to go back and say, okay, what's the backstory to this? And so it was in that context that they looked at the 2002 riots. The government directed Twitter. We still haven't seen the text, by the way, of that order. But the government directed Twitter to delete the links, and Twitter complied immediately. So the reason behind these new laws and initiatives under the information technology rules is because the government is quite confident that it has controlled the media narrative when it comes to television and newspapers. But digital is still a space that is relatively free and independent, and that's because of the way that we are structured. So in order to put pressure and to ensure that digital content does not have a far and wide reach, you then find ways to criminalize the dissemination of stories on social media. And I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, that technology has created a level playing field for the likes of you and me, who without crores of rupees are able to disseminate our stories to the widest possible public through social media. If you present to the social media intermediaries the possibility that they can be prosecuted for circulating my stories, then you pull the rug from under my feet as far as dissemination is concerned. So that is why the government is going down that route. And of course, this matter is being litigated. I'm confident that the courts in India, which have always understood the importance of media freedom, will, on this issue too, take a stand in defense of the Constitution. This is the expectation of journalists, editors, and I dare say the majority of people. There are also, there is a problem in South Asia of physical threats, whether it's in Bangladesh or in Pakistan. In Sri Lanka too, journalists have been assassinated in the past. In India, Gauri Lankesh, Shujat Bukhari have been shot dead. Their killers are still evading justice, although there is a trial on in the case of Gauri Lankesh's assassins at least. In the northeast, in Chhattisgarh, there are many examples of physical intimidation of journalists, which is why South Asia is also one of those regions of great danger, physical danger for journalists. And I think this is something that we also need to take on board, particularly at the South Asian level when we when we speak about the threat and the challenges that media faces. I'd like to end here because I do want to have some time for Q&A from the audience with reiterating the point I made at the beginning that I cannot underscore enough the importance of having platforms like this. To have in Nepal a place in South Asia that journalists, but this is not just a question for journalists. I would say lawyers and jurists, academics, artists and cultural workers, trade unionists, if they want to have pan-South Asian discussions, it's virtually impossible. India won't give visas for Pakistanis to come. Pakistanis won't give visas for Indians to go. We have the added problem in India of, this may surprise you in Nepal to learn this, but in order to have any kind of a quote-unquote political event, those invited from abroad need to come on conference visas, and the theme of that conference has to be approved by the External Affairs Ministry and the Home Ministry. So you have multiple layers of intrusion. In fact, 3 years ago, the External Affairs Ministry went so far as to try to tell Indian universities, because until now, if you want to invite a foreign scholar to India for a conference, that scholar has to get a conference visa, which depends on the government giving permission for that conference. So during the pandemic, Zoom became a very common way for people to interact. And some bright spark in the government woke up and says, "Arey, ye to log Zoom pe baat kar rahe hain." So you believe it or not, a government notification was issued that to all government universities that even before if you have any event where you are getting foreign scholars to join, even on Zoom, you must get the theme of the conference and the invitation list cleared by the government. Can you believe that a democracy can even think like this? And of course, there was outrage, and in this particular case, better sense prevailed, and the government then withdrew that circular. So that this isn't a problem for having Zoom events, but I'm flagging this because you have an illustration of where things can go if you take the current openness in Nepal for granted. So guard it, protect it, nurture it, and develop Nepal as a platform in South Asia where people from India, the Maldives, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and I would say I support Kanak Mani Dikshit's definition of South Asia as from Afghanistan to Myanmar, that this is geographically, historically, one space, we have common challenges, where Kathmandu or any other part of Nepal can serve as a platform for us to interact. And I think keeping in mind this openness and the media's role in defending that openness, whatever else we may do or may not do in Nepal, as editors, as journalists, as reporters, I think preserving this space, this ability for us to converse in a civil manner, to share our experiences, to share our common concerns, to share solutions that we think we might have that work for one and that might work for another, I think is absolutely essential. Thank you once again for inviting me and for honoring me with the task of giving keynote speech.